Canada. Polite, peaceful, maple syrup and hockey. The country the whole world holds up as a model of kindness. But behind every perfectly pressed apology is a history so dark, so deliberately buried, that entire generations of Canadians grew up never knowing it existed. Tonight, we are pulling back the curtain on 50 secrets your teacher was too afraid to tell you. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. Number 1. The Beothuk genocide that Canada pretends was a natural extinction. The Beothuk people of Newfoundland did not simply disappear. They were hunted. By the time European settlers had firmly established themselves along the coasts of what is now Newfoundland, the Beothuk faced a systematic campaign of violence that the history books have long called a tragic extinction, as though nature itself was responsible. The truth is far more deliberate and far more disturbing. For over 2 centuries, European fishermen and settlers treated the Beothuk as obstacles to be removed rather than people to be respected. Hunting parties were organized specifically to drive the Beothuk away from coastal areas, cutting them off from their primary food sources. The Beothuk had relied on the sea for generations, harvesting fish, seals, and seabirds. When European settlers monopolized the coastline, the Beothuk were forced inland into territory far less abundant in food. They began to starve, and when starvation made them desperate enough to take tools or food from European camps, settlers used it as justification for further violence. The British colonial government offered rewards for capturing Beothuk individuals, framing it as a civilizing mission. What actually happened was a campaign of terror. Women and children were not spared. The few Beothuk who survived into the 19th century were isolated, traumatized, and dying of tuberculosis, introduced by the very settlers who had driven them from their homeland. The last known Beothuk, a woman named Shanodithit, died in 1829. She had watched her entire nation be erased. Canada's history textbooks for decades described the Beothuk as a people who vanished, as though an entire nation simply decided to stop existing. The word erases agency. It erases the perpetrators. It erases accountability. The Beothuk did not vanish. They were destroyed piece by piece through deliberate violence, deliberate starvation, and deliberate exclusion from the resources they needed to survive. The erasure extended beyond physical bodies. The Beothuk language, their songs, their ceremonies, their understanding of the land they had occupied for thousands of years, all of it died with Shanodithit. Number 2. The Scalping Proclamation of 1749. In 1749, Governor Edward Cornwallis of Nova Scotia issued a proclamation that is one of the most disturbing documents in Canadian colonial history. He offered a bounty for the scalps of Mi'kmaq, men, women, and children. This was not a rumor, not a disputed historical claim. It was official British colonial policy, signed and sanctioned. The Mi'kmaq had been the original inhabitants of the region for thousands of years. Their resistance to British encroachment on their lands was treated not as legitimate defense of their territory, but as terrorism. Cornwallis, frustrated by Mi'kmaq raids on colonial settlements, decided that extermination was preferable to negotiation. The scalp bounty was set at 10 guineas per scalp, equivalent to several months of wages for an ordinary worker at the time. For years, a statue of Edward Cornwallis stood in the heart of Halifax, the city he founded. The man was celebrated as a founding father, while his scalping proclamation sat largely unmentioned in mainstream Canadian history. It was not until Mi'kmaq activists and historians began loudly demanding the acknowledgement of this history that the broader Canadian public began to confront what Cornwallis had actually done. The statue was eventually removed in 2018 after years of protests, but the delay itself tells a story about whose version of history Canada has chosen to protect. Cornwallis never faced consequences. He was eventually recalled to Britain for unrelated military failures, not for his genocidal policy toward the Mi'kmaq. He died a celebrated officer. The Mi'kmaq people who survived his tenure in Nova Scotia carried that trauma forward through generations. The Mi'kmaq did not simply accept their fate. They continued to resist, signing treaties with the British that the British repeatedly violated. Today, the peace and friendship treaties of the 1700s are recognized by Canadian courts as legally binding agreements that were never fully honored. The Mi'kmaq never surrendered their territory. They signed agreements to share it and to keep the peace. The difference matters enormously in contemporary land claims and resource rights disputes that are still being litigated in Canadian courts today. Number 3. The residential school system's true death toll. The residential school system is the darkest chapter of Canadian history, and even now, the full horror of it is not completely understood. For over a century, Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and placed in church-run, government-funded schools where the explicit goal, stated plainly by the architect of the policy, was to kill the Indian in the child. Duncan Campbell Scott, the Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs in the early 20th century, said those words openly, "Kill the Indian in the child." He also acknowledged in writing that the death rate in residential schools was alarming and that the government knew it. He continued the policy anyway. Children as young as 4 and 5 years old were taken from their homes, sometimes by RCMP, officers who forcibly separated them from screaming parents. At the schools, they were forbidden from speaking their languages. They were given numbers instead of names. They were beaten for praying in their own traditions. They were subjected to medical experiments, nutritional deprivation studies, and sexual abuse on a scale so widespread and so systematically enabled that it constituted institutionalized predation. And they died in enormous numbers. The National Center for Truth and Reconciliation has documented over 4,000 confirmed deaths of children at residential schools. But researchers and survivors' families widely believe the actual number is far higher. Many children were buried in unmarked graves. Many deaths were never recorded. The discovery in 2021 of what appeared to be the remains of 215 children buried in unmarked graves at the site of the former Kamloops Indian residential school sent shockwaves through Canada, but it was not a surprise to Indigenous communities. They had been saying this for decades. Canada simply had not been listening. The intergenerational trauma of the residential school system is not a historical artifact. It is a living reality in Indigenous communities across Canada. Survivors who were never able to bond with their own children because they had been stripped of all experience of family and affection passed their wounds forward. Number 4, the Chinese head tax and the 40 years of silence. Between 1885 and 1923, the Canadian government charged Chinese immigrants a fee simply for being Chinese. It was called the Chinese head tax, and it was one of the most openly racist pieces of legislation in Canadian history. The tax started at $50, a sum equivalent to 2 months of wages for a laborer at the time, and was raised to $100 in 1900 and then $500 in 1903. $500 in 1903 was approximately 2 years of wages for a Chinese laborer. The policy was designed specifically to prevent Chinese workers from bringing their families to Canada. The Canadian government had been happy to exploit Chinese labor during the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway. Thousands of Chinese workers had blasted through mountains and laid track through some of the most dangerous terrain in North America. Hundreds died. Once the railway was complete, Canada decided it no longer needed Chinese workers and certainly did not want them becoming permanent residents or citizens. The head tax devastated Chinese Canadian families. Men who had come to Canada for work could not afford to bring their wives and children. Families were separated for years, sometimes decades, sometimes permanently. Children grew up without fathers. Couples grew old apart. And when the head tax was finally deemed insufficient to keep Chinese immigration low enough, Canada passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1923, which effectively banned Chinese immigration entirely. The Exclusion Act was not repealed until 1947. Canada did not formally apologize for the head tax until 2006, over a century after it was first implemented. By that time, the majority of people who had paid the tax were long dead. Canada issued symbolic payments to surviving taxpayers and their spouses, but the full generational damage of the policy, the fractured families, the lost opportunities, the decades of second-class status, was never fully addressed. The communities that formed in the gaps left by the head tax were remarkable in their resilience. Chinese Canadians built benevolent societies, clan associations, and mutual aid networks to support men who had no families nearby. Number 5. The Japanese Canadian internment and the stolen property. Canada's treatment of Japanese Canadians during the Second World War is often overshadowed in public memory by the more widely discussed American internment camps. But Canada's actions were in some ways worse, and the theft that accompanied the internment was systematic, legal, and never fully compensated. After Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the Canadian government declared all people of Japanese heritage, including Canadian citizens and people born in Canada, to be enemy aliens. Over 22,000 Japanese Canadians were forcibly removed from their homes along the British Columbia coast. They were given almost no time to arrange their affairs. Businesses, homes, fishing boats, and farms were seized by the government and sold, often at a fraction of their actual value, to white Canadians. The Japanese Canadian community had spent generations building those businesses and farms. They were gone in weeks. The money from the forced sales was used, in part, to fund the internment itself. Japanese Canadians were essentially forced to pay for their own imprisonment. The internment camps were in the interior of British Columbia and in the prairies. Families were sometimes separated, with men sent to road construction camps, while women, children, and elderly people were housed in overcrowded facilities with inadequate food, heat, and medical care. People died. Children missed years of education. After the war ended, Japanese Canadians were not simply released. They were given a choice: relocate east of the Rockies or be deported to Japan. Many were deported to a country many had never visited and did not consider home. The property confiscation was never reversed. The formal apology did not come until 1988, over 40 years later, when Prime Minister Brian Mulroney acknowledged that the internment had been wrong. Survivors received $12,000 each in compensation. $12,000 for the loss of homes, businesses, years of freedom, and a lifetime of trauma. The full inventory of what was lost has never been compiled. Fishing boats, canneries, farms, stores, homes, savings, and family heirlooms were gone within weeks. Number 6. The Kamagata Maru Incident. In 1914, a ship called the Kamagata Maru arrived in Vancouver Harbor carrying 376 passengers, almost all of them Sikhs, Muslims, and Hindus from British India. They were British subjects, entitled under the laws of the British Empire to travel freely within its territories. Canada had other ideas. The Canadian government had passed regulations specifically designed to prevent South Asian immigration, including the Continuous Journey Regulation of 1908, which required immigrants to come to Canada by continuous journey from their country of origin. Since no shipping line offered direct service from India to Canada, this effectively made legal immigration from South Asia impossible. The Komagata Maru had chartered a Japanese vessel and stopped briefly in Japan and Hong Kong specifically to challenge this regulation. For 2 months, the ship sat in Vancouver Harbor, while passengers were refused permission to land. They were given inadequate food and water. Canadian officials boarded the ship to turn back passengers. The passengers resisted. Canadian authorities eventually brought in a naval cruiser and ordered the ship to leave Canadian waters. When the Komagata Maru returned to Calcutta, British Indian authorities considered the passengers to be suspected revolutionaries because they had defied imperial law. Police opened fire on the passengers as they disembarked. 19 people were killed. Others were imprisoned. Canada did not apologize for the Komagata Maru incident until 2016, over 100 years after the ship was turned away. The apology was given in Parliament by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. It acknowledged that the Canadian government's actions had been wrong, rooted in racism, and a permanent stain on the country's history. That apology came a century too late for everyone who had suffered its consequences. The passengers who survived the return to Calcutta and who were not imprisoned or killed had to rebuild their lives with the knowledge that a country claiming to be a beacon of civilization had turned them away at gunpoint, rationed their food while they waited in the harbor, and then sent a warship to enforce their departure. Number 7. The 60s. Scoop. The residential school system ended officially in the 1990s, with the last school closing in 1996. But before it ended, Canadian governments had already found another method for separating Indigenous children from their families and cultures. It was called the 60s Scoop, and it operated from the 1960s through the 1980s, with some of its effects continuing into the 1990s. Child welfare agencies across Canada began removing Indigenous children from their homes and communities at staggering rates. The stated justification was child protection, but the actual standard being applied was cultural. Indigenous family structures, parenting practices, and living conditions that did not match middle-class white Canadian norms were treated as evidence of neglect. Children were taken from grandparents who were raising them, a traditional and honored practice in many Indigenous cultures, because child welfare workers did not recognize non-nuclear family structures. Tens of thousands of Indigenous children were removed from their communities and placed with white Canadian families, or sent to the United States and other countries for adoption. They were systematically stripped of their languages, their cultural identities, and their connections to their communities. Many grew up not knowing they were Indigenous. Many had their identities falsified on legal documents. The trauma of the 60s Scoop manifested in devastating ways across multiple generations. Adults who had been scooped as children struggled with identity, loss, addiction, depression, and suicide at rates far higher than the general population. Many tried for years to reconnect with their birth families and communities, only to find that their languages had been erased from them and their names had been changed so completely that records were nearly impossible to trace. In 2017, a judge ruled that Canada had breached its duty to Indigenous children through the 60s Scoop, and that a class action lawsuit could proceed. In 2018, the Canadian government agreed to a settlement, but survivors and advocates widely considered it insufficient given the scale of what had happened. Number 8. The starvation experiments on Indigenous children. In 1942, a Canadian government scientist named Percy Moore, in collaboration with a University of Toronto, nutritionist named Frederick Tisdall, initiated a series of nutrition experiments on Indigenous children in residential schools and on reserves. These were not minor studies. They were deliberate experiments that involved withholding adequate food from children who were already malnourished in order to study the effects of different interventions. Children were divided into control groups. Some received nutritional supplements. Others did not. The ones who did not were, by design, left in states of nutritional deficiency while researchers observed and documented what happened to their bodies and their development. Dental health, physical development, and cognitive performance were measured. The children were not able to consent. Their parents were not informed. The experiments continued for years. The full extent of these experiments was not publicly known until historian Ian Mosby published his research in 2013. The Canadian government's initial response was deeply inadequate, framing the experiments as reflecting the norms of the time, rather than acknowledging them as the abuse of vulnerable children that they were. Survivors and their families described the revelation as confirmation of things they had long suspected but never been able to prove, that the institutions responsible for their care had seen them not as children deserving of protection, but as research subjects. No one was ever charged with any crime in connection with these experiments. The scientists involved had careers celebrated by Canadian institutions. Their research was published in academic journals. The children they experimented on grew up, in many cases, not knowing what had been done to them. The experiments conducted by Moore and Tisdall were part of a broader pattern of treating Indigenous and institutionalized people as research subjects without consent, a pattern that was not unique to Canada, but that took on a specific character in the residential school context because the children involved were already in a condition of profound powerlessness. They could not refuse. They had no parents nearby to advocate for them. Number 9. The Night of the Long Knives and Pierre, Trudeau's constitutional betrayal. In November 1981, the premiers of 9 Canadian provinces and Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau gathered in Ottawa to finalize the patriation of the Canadian Constitution, the legal process of bringing Canada's foundational document fully under Canadian jurisdiction for the first time. Indigenous peoples had been fighting for inclusion in this process, for recognition of their rights within the new constitutional framework. In the middle of the night, while Indigenous leaders and Quebec's Premier René Lévesque slept, the other 9 premiers and Trudeau hammered out a deal. This agreement, reached without Quebec and without any Indigenous participation, became the basis for the Constitution Act of 1982. It included the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It also included provisions about Indigenous and treaty rights, but those provisions had been weakened at the last minute in the night negotiations in ways that Indigenous advocates had explicitly warned against. Indigenous peoples were not at the table when their rights were being decided. A conference that had included them was shut out of the final decisive moment. The deal was done without them. Leaders who had traveled to Ottawa specifically to advocate for their communities woke up to find that the most consequential constitutional moment of the century had passed while they were sleeping. The long-term consequences of this betrayal are difficult to overstate. The constitutional provisions for Indigenous rights that emerged from that process have been subject to decades of litigation, with the courts repeatedly being asked to define what those rights actually mean because the politicians who wrote them were deliberately vague. The vagueness was not an accident. It was a choice made in a kitchen in Ottawa in the middle of the night. The Indigenous leaders who woke up to find that the constitutional moment had passed without them drew a lesson that has shaped Indigenous political strategy ever since. Never trust that inclusion in a process will translate into inclusion in the final decision. Number 10. The enfranchisement trap. For most of Canadian history, Indigenous people were subject to a legal framework that gave them 2 choices: remain on reserves subject to the restrictions of the Indian Act, with no right to vote in federal elections, or give up their status and their rights through a process called enfranchisement. Enfranchisement meant surrendering Indian status in exchange for the full rights of Canadian citizenship, including the right to vote. This was not a neutral choice. Enfranchisement meant leaving your reserve, your community, and your culture. It meant giving up treaty rights and land rights. It meant, in many cases, cutting yourself off permanently from your family and your people. The Indian Act also imposed automatic enfranchisement without consent in certain circumstances. A status. Indian woman who married a non-Indigenous man automatically lost her status. Her children lost their status. Her husband, if he was a non-Indian man who married into the community, gained status. The gendered injustice of this provision was breathtaking. Indigenous people could not vote in Canadian federal elections until 1960. That is not a typo. 1960, Canada had been granting the vote to women since 1918. Canada had extended voting rights to Japanese Canadians in 1948 and to Chinese Canadians the year before that. Indigenous people, the original inhabitants of the land, were the last group to receive the right to vote, and they received it only after international pressure, including scrutiny from the United Nations, made Canada's position impossible to maintain. The enfranchisement provisions of the Indian Act were not fully reformed until 1985, when Bill C-31 restored status to Indigenous women who had lost it through marriage and to their descendants. The right to vote sounds like a simple thing, but the conditions under which Indigenous people received it in 1960 illustrate how much had been withheld and for how long. Indigenous veterans of the Second World War who returned home in 1945 had no vote. Indigenous peoples who had watched their children taken to residential schools in the 1950s had no vote. Number 11. The Duplessis Orphans. In the province of Quebec, between the 1940s and the 1960s, thousands of children who had been placed in Catholic orphanages were reclassified as mentally ill. The reason was entirely financial. The federal government paid more per capita for psychiatric hospital patients than for orphans. Premier Maurice Duplessis, working in close collaboration with the Catholic Church, arranged to have orphanages reclassified as psychiatric hospitals so that the province and the church could collect the higher federal funding. The children living in those institutions had nothing wrong with them mentally. They were orphans, many of them born to unmarried mothers in a deeply Catholic society that treated illegitimacy as a profound shame. Some were children of Indigenous or marginalized women. They were children who needed care. Instead, they were given diagnoses they did not have, placed in psychiatric facilities, subjected to treatments designed for mentally ill patients, including electroshock therapy and experimental drug regimens, and denied the education that other Quebec children received. Many were also subjected to physical and sexual abuse by clergy and staff. They grew up in institutions designed not for their flourishing, but for their control. When they were released as adults, they had no education, no skills, no families, no money, and no records of what had been done to them. The Duplessis orphans organized in the 1990s and began demanding acknowledgement and compensation. The Quebec government's response was deeply inadequate. The Catholic Church was even slower to respond. Formal acknowledgments came years after many survivors had already died. The full scope of what was done to these children, who numbered in the tens of thousands, has never been properly accounted for. The Quebec government's handling of the Duplessis orphan scandal stands as one of the more revealing episodes in the history of how Canadian institutions protect themselves. When survivors began organizing and going public in the early 1990s, the initial response from both the provincial government and the Catholic Church was to question their credibility, to minimize the numbers and to dispute the characterization of what had happened as abuse. Number 12. The expulsion of the Acadians. In 1755, British colonial authorities in Nova Scotia carried out one of the largest forced deportations in North American history. The Acadian people, French-speaking settlers who had lived in the region for over a century and had established peaceful relationships with Mi'kmaq people, were given an ultimatum: swear an unconditional oath of loyalty to the British Crown or be expelled. Most Acadians declined to swear an unconditional oath because they feared it would require them to take up arms against the French, their ancestral people, if war broke out. The British authorities decided this constituted a threat. Governor Charles Lawrence, without explicit authorization from London, ordered the deportation of the entire Acadian population. British soldiers arrived at Acadian villages in September 1755 and ordered men and boys to gather at their churches, where they were informed that their lands, homes, and livestock had been confiscated by the Crown and that they were to be deported. Families were separated. Husbands and wives were put on different ships. Children were separated from parents. The ships were overcrowded, poorly provisioned, and disease-ridden. Hundreds died at sea. Acadians were scattered across the Atlantic world. Some ended up in France. Some ended up in the French Caribbean. Some ended up in what is now Louisiana, where their descendants became the Cajun people. Some were sent to the American colonies, where they were generally unwelcome. Some were simply abandoned on ships that were beached and left to drift. The death toll was enormous. Some estimates suggest that a third of the Acadian population died as a direct result of the deportation. The deportation, known to Acadians as Le Grand Dérangement, was eventually resumed by the British in subsequent years, continuing through the 1760s. The British colonial government distributed confiscated Acadian farmland to Protestant New England settlers. The Acadian people who survived and eventually made their way back to Nova Scotia found their farms occupied, their communities destroyed, and their presence unwanted. Number 13. The murder of Thomas Scott and the Red River Resistance. In 1869 and 1870, the Métis people of the Red River Settlement, in what is now Manitoba, led by Louis Riel, staged a resistance against Canada's unilateral annexation of their territory from the Hudson's Bay Company. The Métis had lived in the Red River region for generations. They had not been consulted about the transfer of their homeland to the new nation of Canada. They had not been asked what kind of government they wanted. They simply woke up one day and were told they were Canadians. Louis Riel organized a provisional government to negotiate the terms of Manitoba's entry into Confederation. The negotiations produced the Manitoba Act of 1870, which granted Manitoba provincial status and included significant protections for the Métis, including land grants and bilingual official status for English and French. This was, by any measure, a successful resistance that achieved real political outcomes through negotiation. But during the period of the provisional government, a man named Thomas Scott, a Protestant Ontarian who had been agitating violently against the Métis provisional government and who had participated in an armed attempt to overthrow it, was captured, tried by a Métis tribunal, and executed. The execution of Thomas Scott became a rallying cry for anti-Métis, anti-Catholic sentiment in Ontario. When Riel eventually came to Manitoba to take a seat in the Canadian Parliament to which he had been elected, a warrant was out for his arrest. He spent years in exile. When he later led the Northwest Resistance of 1885, he was captured, tried for treason, and hanged. The trial was widely criticized as politically motivated. The jury had recommended mercy. The judge had recommended mercy. John A. Macdonald, facing enormous political pressure from Ontario Protestants who wanted Riel dead, rejected both recommendations. Riel was hanged on November 16, 1885. He has since been recognized by the Canadian Parliament as a father of Confederation. The recognition came over a century after his execution. The political use of Riel's execution extended beyond his death. Orange Protestant organizations in Ontario used Riel as a symbol to inflame anti-French, anti-Catholic sentiment for decades afterward. Number 14. Smallpox. Blankets and biological warfare against indigenous peoples. The deliberate distribution of smallpox-infected blankets to indigenous peoples is one of the most contested and emotionally charged claims in North American colonial history. But the historical evidence, at least in certain cases, is clear. This happened. It was intentional, and it was devastating. The most thoroughly documented case involves the correspondence of British military commander Sir Geoffrey Amherst during Pontiac's War in 1763. In letters exchanged with his subordinate Colonel Henry Bouquet, Amherst explicitly suggested distributing smallpox-infected blankets to hostile indigenous peoples and expressed his desire to extirpate the Indian race. Bouquet replied that he had already thought of the same idea, noting that some infected blankets had already been given to delegations of indigenous leaders at Fort Pitt. Whether this specific act of biological warfare was fully carried out as intended is debated by historians, but the intent was explicit and documented. The smallpox outbreak among indigenous peoples of the Ohio Valley that followed shortly afterward killed enormous numbers of people. In the Canadian context, there is strong circumstantial and documentary evidence that smallpox was deliberately spread among indigenous peoples on multiple occasions during the period of colonial expansion. The Buffalo Lake Cree and other Plains nations suffered catastrophic smallpox epidemics in the 1870s and 1880s, the same period when the Canadian government was doing everything it could to clear the plains for agricultural settlement by reducing indigenous populations. Deliberate infection was not the only tool used, but historians have documented instances where infected goods were distributed in circumstances that strongly suggest intent. The overall mortality from disease among indigenous peoples in North America is estimated at somewhere between 50 and 90% of the pre-contact population. While much of this was the result of first contact with diseases to which indigenous peoples had no immunity, the deliberate exploitation of this vulnerability and the intentional spread of disease were documented tools of colonial policy. Number 15. The Winnipeg General Strike and the Government Crackdown. In 1919, 35,000 workers in Winnipeg walked off the job in the largest general strike in Canadian history. It lasted 42 days. Workers demanded collective bargaining rights, a living wage, and the 8-hour workday. The strike was overwhelmingly peaceful. It was supported by workers across virtually every industry in the city, including workers from the police force who participated in sympathy. The response from the Canadian government and the Winnipeg business establishment was to characterize the strike as a Bolshevik revolution. Canada had just watched the Russian Revolution upend an empire. Wealthy Canadians were terrified that the same could happen here. The government of Prime Minister Robert Bourdain took extraordinary measures. Immigration laws were changed specifically to allow the deportation of foreign-born strike leaders. The Immigration Act was amended in a matter of days to add sedition as grounds for deportation, a change crafted explicitly to deal with the strike. On June 17, 1919, the Royal Northwest Mounted Police arrested the leaders of the strike on charges of seditious conspiracy. On June 21st, a Saturday known in Canadian labor history as Bloody Saturday, the RNWMP charged into a crowd of peaceful demonstrators on Winnipeg's Main Street on horseback. Gunfire was exchanged. 2 men were killed. Dozens were injured. The strike was broken within days. The strike leaders, including J.S. Woodsworth, who would later become the founder of the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation and one of the most celebrated figures in Canadian political history, were prosecuted. Some were convicted, none were executed, but the prosecution sent a clear message. Labor organizing would be treated as sedition. The right of workers to organize and strike was not formally recognized in Canadian law until decades later. The legacy of the Winnipeg General Strike runs directly through the foundation of the Canadian welfare state. J.S. Woodsworth, arrested during the strike, went on to found the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, which became the new Democratic Party, which pushed every successive Canadian government to adopt the social programs that define Canadian identity today. Number 16, the Halibut Treaty and the Struggle for Canadian Sovereignty. This is a secret of a different kind, not a horror story, but a revelation about how dependent Canada was on Britain for its own sovereignty for far longer than most Canadians realize. In 1923, Canada negotiated the Halibut Treaty with the United States, a fisheries agreement covering the North Pacific. Prime Minister Mackenzie King insisted that Canada had the right to sign this treaty independently without a British co-signature. The British government was outraged. The principle that Canada could conduct its own foreign affairs, make its own treaties, and speak for itself in international law was not yet fully established. Britain considered Canada's foreign affairs to be British foreign affairs. That Canada might negotiate and sign a treaty that bound Canada, but not Britain, on a matter of purely Canadian interest, was treated as an affront to imperial order. King prevailed. The Halibut Treaty was signed by Canada alone. It was one of the first times that a dominion of the British Empire had negotiated and signed an international treaty independently. It was a milestone in Canadian sovereignty that most Canadians do not know about. But the deeper secret is what the Halibut Treaty reveals about the relationship. Canada had been a nation, nominally, since 1867. It had sent its own soldiers to die in the First World War. It had its own parliament, its own prime minister, its own laws. And yet, in 1923, it still required a fight to establish the principle that Canada could sign its own international agreements. The full legal sovereignty of Canada was not achieved until the Statute of Westminster in 1931, and even then, the Canadian Constitution remained in Britain until 1982. The Halibut Treaty significance is best understood by contrast with what came before and after. Before 1923, Canada had no independent treaty-making power. After the Statute of Westminster in 1931, Canada had full legal sovereignty over its foreign affairs. The Halibut Treaty sits at the midpoint of that journey, a single negotiation that helped establish the principle that Canada was a nation capable of speaking for itself. Most Canadians do not know what the Halibut Treaty is. Number 17, the Eskimo Identification Disc System. From 1941 until the 1970s, the Canadian government assigned disc numbers to Inuit people across the Arctic. These were small leather or metal discs inscribed with a letter indicating the district and a number identifying the individual. Inuit people were required to carry these discs and present them to government officials, traders, and missionaries for identification purposes. The system was created because Canadian government officials found Inuit names, which often included syllabic sounds unfamiliar to English speakers, difficult to record. The solution was not to learn Inuit names or to develop a respectful system for recording them. The solution was to eliminate the need to learn them entirely by replacing names with numbers. Think about what it means to be given a number instead of a name, to be recorded in government documents, not as a person with a name, a family, a history, but as a code. 7-0. 121 W 9-033. These were how Inuit people appeared in the records of the country that claimed sovereignty over their territory. The disc system was explicitly modeled, in part, on dog tag systems used in the military. The system was eventually replaced in the 1970s with a project called Project Surname, in which Inuit people were encouraged to adopt and register surnames. But the project was conducted with the same lack of consultation that had characterized the disc system. Government workers often assigned anglicized surnames based on phonetic approximations of Inuit names, or simply registered whatever name seemed easiest for them. Inuit people found themselves with official surnames they had not chosen, derived from bureaucratic convenience, rather than their own identities. The disc system has been compared by indigenous scholars to the tattooing of numbers on prisoners in Nazi concentration camps. The comparison is, in context, not hyperbolic. Both were systems designed to make human beings easier to manage by replacing their names with numbers. The Canadian government has never issued a formal apology specifically for the disc system. The psychological impact of the disc system is something that survivors have described in terms that go beyond bureaucratic inconvenience. Number 18. The First Nations Pass System. Between 1885 and approximately 1941, Indigenous people on reserves in Western Canada were subject to a pass system that required them to obtain written permission from their Indian agent before they were allowed to leave their reserves. Without a pass, they could be turned back by police, and in some cases, arrested. The pass system had no legal basis. It was never enshrined in the Indian Act or any other legislation. It was simply imposed by government officials through bureaucratic enforcement, and it was upheld through the threat of police action. The NWMP, later the RCMP, enforced the passes, even though legal advisors within the government acknowledged that the system lacked legal authority. The enforcement continued anyway. The pass system was introduced in the aftermath of the Northwest Resistance of 1885, explicitly as a tool for controlling indigenous populations and preventing the kind of coordinated resistance that Riel had led. It was a system of apartheid imposed by bureaucratic fiat. Indigenous people who needed to go to town to buy food, to seek medical care, to visit family on other reserves, to attend ceremonies or conduct trade, required the written permission of a government official who was explicitly tasked with managing and controlling their lives. Indian agents wielded enormous power over the lives of the people they administered. They could deny passes for any reason or no reason. They could approve them selectively to reward compliance and deny them to punish resistance. They controlled the food supplies on reserves, the distribution of annuity payments, and access to government services. The pass system added freedom of movement to the list of rights that Indian agents controlled. The pass system was not formally abolished. It simply fell into disuse as enforcement became increasingly difficult to justify even on bureaucratic grounds. Indigenous people resisted it from the beginning, and its gradual abandonment reflected their persistent defiance more than any decision by the Canadian government to recognize it as wrong. The illegal nature of the pass system was known within the government from very early on. Legal advisors warned that the passes had no statutory basis. Number 19. The potlatch ban. The potlatch is one of the most important cultural, social, economic, and spiritual institutions of the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest Coast. It is a ceremony in which a host family distributes gifts to guests, demonstrating wealth and social standing through generosity rather than accumulation. Potlatches mark important life events, settle debts and disputes, transfer rights and privileges, and reinforce the social fabric of communities. They are, in every meaningful sense, foundational to the cultures of peoples, like the Kwakwaka'wakw, the Haida, the Tsimshian, and dozens of other nations. In 1885, Canada made the potlatch illegal. The potlatch ban was written into the Indian Act and remained there until 1951. 66 years. For 66 years, one of the most central and sacred cultural practices of Pacific Northwest Indigenous peoples was a criminal offense in Canada. The ban was supported by missionaries and Indian agents who viewed the potlatch as anti-Christian, as encouraging idleness and the destruction of property through the redistribution of wealth, and as an obstacle to the assimilation of Indigenous peoples into the Canadian economic system. That the potlatch represented a sophisticated economic and social system that had sustained complex societies for thousands of years was not a consideration that entered the analysis of the people who banned it. People were arrested for holding potlatches. In 1921, one of the most famous violations of the ban occurred when the Kwakwaka'wakw chief, Dan Cranmer, hosted a large potlatch on Village Island. Over 40 participants were arrested. 22 were convicted and sentenced to jail. But as part of the prosecution, they were offered suspended sentences if they agreed to surrender their ceremonial regalia, the masks, blankets, coppers, and other sacred objects central to their ceremonies. Most accepted this deal to avoid imprisonment. The confiscated regalia was distributed to museums across Canada and the world, where much of it sat in storage for decades. The fight to repatriate the confiscated regalia began in the 1960s and continues to this day. Many pieces have been returned to the communities from which they were taken. Many have not. Number 20. The Aboriginal veterans who lost their farms. When Canada sent soldiers to fight in the First World War and the Second World War, it promised returning veterans that they would be supported in rebuilding their lives. The Veterans Land Act provided returning soldiers with grants and loans to purchase farmland and establish themselves as farmers. It was one of the most comprehensive veteran support programs in Canadian history, and it helped tens of thousands of white Canadian veterans build prosperous lives. Indigenous veterans who returned from the same wars were largely excluded from these benefits. In many cases, the Indian Act explicitly prevented Indigenous people from applying for land grants outside of reserves. In other cases, Indian agents administered the programs on reserves and distributed them so incompletely, so selectively, and with so much bureaucratic obstruction that Indigenous veterans received a fraction of what their white counterparts received. Some Indigenous veterans came home from fighting overseas for Canada to find that their land on reserves had been expropriated in their absence. The government had taken reserve land for various purposes, including military training grounds and agricultural expansion, while the land's owners were overseas fighting for the country that was simultaneously stealing their property. Indigenous veterans were also excluded from many of the social programs available to white veterans. They were barred from veterans clubs in many towns. They were denied access to disability benefits that white veterans received. They had fought in the same mud, breathed the same gas, and died alongside the same men. They came home to a country that recognized their service selectively at best. The failure to provide equal benefits to Indigenous veterans is a specific and documented injustice that has been acknowledged by Canadian governments in recent decades, but comprehensive redress has never been provided. The exclusion of Indigenous veterans from veterans' benefits had practical consequences that compounded over generations. A white veteran who received a farm under the Veterans Land Act built equity, left property to his children, and established a foundation for multi-generational wealth. Number 21. The forced sterilization of Indigenous and disabled women. Alberta was the only Canadian province to pass formal eugenics legislation. the Sexual Sterilization Act of 1928, but the practice of forcibly sterilizing women deemed unfit to reproduce occurred across Canada and continued far longer than the official legislative history suggests. Alberta's Sexual Sterilization Act established a eugenics board with the power to authorize the sterilization of institutionalized people without their consent, and without the consent of their families in some cases. Over 2,800 people were sterilized under this legislation before it was repealed in 1972. A disproportionate number of them were Indigenous women, women from immigrant families, and women who had been labeled mentally deficient, a category that in practice included many people who were simply poor, poorly educated, or from cultural backgrounds unfamiliar to the board's white, middle-class members. But formal legislation was only part of the story. Across Canada, Indigenous women were subjected to sterilization in hospitals without their informed consent, sometimes during or immediately after childbirth. Women reported being handed consent forms while in labor, in pain, and without adequate explanation of what they were signing. Women reported being told that they could not leave the hospital with their babies unless they signed. Women reported waking up from cesarean sections to be informed that they had also been sterilized. Indigenous women across Canada were reporting forced sterilizations to authorities, to Indigenous organizations, and to the United Nations for decades. A Senate committee report in 2021 confirmed that forced and coerced sterilization of Indigenous women continued to occur in Canada up to at least 2018. Not in 1928, not in 1972, 2018. The Canadian government promised legislative action. As of this recording, that legislative action remains incomplete. The persistence of forced sterilization into the 21st century is a fact that many Canadians find almost impossible to believe. Canada has a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Canada has ratified international human rights conventions that explicitly prohibit forced sterilization. Number 22. The Nanaimo coal mines and child labor. In the coal mines of Nanaimo on Vancouver Island in the 19th and early 20th centuries, children as young as 8 years old worked underground. They worked as trappers, sitting in the dark tunnels for hours, opening and closing ventilation doors to direct airflow through the mine. They worked as drivers, leading ponies through the dark. They worked as loaders and haulers. They breathed coal dust. They worked in conditions that, in the event of a gas explosion or collapse, offered no possibility of escape. Mining disasters were common. The Wellington Mine. Explosion of 1884 killed 24 men and boys. The number 1 mine explosion in Nanaimo in 1887 killed 148 men and boys. This was one of the worst mining disasters in Canadian history, and among the dead were children. The explosion was caused by methane gas ignited, in all likelihood, by a miner's lamp. There had been warnings about gas buildup. The warnings had been ignored. The owners of the Nanaimo coal mines were among the wealthiest men in British Columbia. They paid poverty wages, charged miners for their tools and their housing, and resisted every effort to improve safety conditions or restrict child labor. When miners went on strike, the owners brought in strike breakers, sometimes from overseas. When strikes turned violent, the militia was called out to protect the owner's property. Child labor in Canadian coal mines was regulated, inadequately and inconsistently, over the course of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But enforcement was weak, and the desperate poverty of mining families meant that children's wages were often necessary for survival. Children continued to work in dangerous conditions long after the laws theoretically should have protected them. The families of miners who died in the Nanaimo collieries received almost nothing in compensation. There was no workers' compensation system in British Columbia in the 19th century. There was no life insurance accessible to working-class families. When a man died in a mine explosion, his wife and children were left with whatever they could earn and whatever neighbors could provide. The mine owner's liability was minimal. Number 23. The theft of black Loyalist land in Nova Scotia. After the American Revolution, thousands of black Loyalists, enslaved people, and free blacks who had fought for or supported the British Crown in exchange for promises of freedom and land were transported to Nova Scotia. The British had promised each family a land grant. They had promised the same land grants they were providing to white Loyalists. They had made these promises to people who had risked everything, and in many cases, given up everything for the British cause. When the black Loyalists arrived in Nova Scotia, the promises were broken. White Loyalists received their grants quickly. Black Loyalists waited years. When grants were finally assigned, they were smaller than what had been promised, in many cases a fraction of what white Loyalists received. The land was often marginal, rocky, or swampy. In some cases, black families who had cleared and farmed their land for years found that it had been reassigned to white settlers by local authorities who simply did not believe that black people had rights worth protecting. The black Loyalist communities, centered particularly around Birchtown near Shelburne, became among the largest free black communities in North America. They were also among the poorest, facing persistent racism, exclusion from employment, denial of the land rights they had been promised, and violence from white communities that resented their presence. Thousands of black Loyalists eventually concluded that Canada could not keep its promises to them and emigrated to Sierra Leone in 1792. The story of the black Loyalists is one of the founding betrayals of Canadian history. It established a pattern of promising freedom and equality to black people, and then systematically denying both, a pattern that would repeat itself throughout Canadian history in ways large and small. The descendants of the black Loyalists who stayed in Nova Scotia, who did not emigrate to Sierra Leone, who endured the poverty and racism and the inferior land grants generation after generation, are the African Nova Scotian community that exists today. Their communities in Preston, North Preston, Cherrybrook, and Hammonds Plains are among the oldest black communities in Canada. Number 24. Viola Desmond and the Canadian Jim Crow Canadians often congratulate themselves on not having had a formal system of racial segregation like the American Jim Crow laws. This congratulation requires ignoring an enormous body of evidence. Racial segregation in Canada was not encoded in a single comprehensive set of laws, but it was real, pervasive, and enforced through a combination of local ordinances, social custom, and explicit policy. Viola Desmond's story is the most famous illustration of this. In November 1946, Desmond, a black Nova Scotia businesswoman and beautician, attended a movie at the Roseland Theatre in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia. She sat in the main floor section. She was asked to move to the balcony, the section designated for black patrons. She refused. She was physically dragged from the theater by a police officer and a male employee. She was charged not under any racial segregation law, because no such law technically existed, but under a provincial tax law. The tax on a balcony ticket was 1 cent more than the tax on a main floor ticket. Desmond had paid for a main floor ticket. She was charged with tax evasion for the 1 cent difference. She was convicted. She appealed. The appeal failed. The Nova Scotia Supreme Court upheld the conviction. Desmond eventually abandoned the legal fight. She moved to Montreal and later to New York, where she died in 1965, 6 years before the province of Nova Scotia formally exonerated her. That exoneration came in 2010, 64 years after the incident. In 2018, Viola Desmond's face was placed on the Canadian $10 bill, making her the first Canadian woman and the first Black Canadian to be featured on Canadian currency. The choice to honor her on currency is meaningful, but it also raises the question of why it took 64 years for an exoneration and the fact that Canada had to put someone's face on money before large numbers of Canadians learned about what had been done to her. Viola Desmond's case is significant not only as an individual story of injustice, but as a window into the systemic nature of anti-Black racism in Canada. The Roseland Theatre did not need a formal segregation law to enforce racial separation. Number 25, the Native Women's Society and the Missing and Murdered. The epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada is not a recent discovery. It is a crisis that Indigenous women's organizations began documenting and raising alarms about decades before the Canadian government was willing to acknowledge it as a systemic problem rather than a series of individual tragedies. The Native Women's Association of Canada and other organizations were tracking cases and demanding action from the 1970s onward. Indigenous women were disappearing and being murdered at rates dramatically higher than non-Indigenous women. Investigations were inadequate. Families were poorly treated by police. Cases went cold. The Highway of Tears in northern British Columbia, a stretch of Highway 16 where Indigenous women have been going missing and being found murdered since at least the 1970s, is only the most geographically concentrated manifestation of a national pattern. For decades, the Canadian government resisted calls for a national inquiry. Conservative governments under Stephen Harper were particularly resistant, with Harper explicitly stating that the issue was criminal rather than systemic, framing it as a series of individual violent crimes rather than acknowledging the structural factors, racism in policing, poverty, geographic isolation, inadequate victim services, and historical trauma that made Indigenous women so vulnerable. The national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls was finally established in 2016. Its final report, released in 2019, concluded that the violence constituted genocide, a conclusion that was contested by some but supported by substantial evidence about the systemic and deliberate nature of the conditions that made Indigenous women so vulnerable. The report included over 200 calls for justice. The Canadian government's implementation of those calls has been consistently criticized as inadequate and too slow. The families of missing and murdered Indigenous women have carried the weight of seeking answers that institutions were unwilling to provide for decades. Mothers who reported their daughters missing were told their daughters had probably just left town. Number 26, the Chinese Exclusion Act's family impact. The full human cost of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1923 goes far beyond statistics. For 24 years, from 1923 to 1947, Chinese immigration to Canada was banned almost entirely. During this period, Canadian Chinese men who had wives and children in China were completely unable to bring them to Canada. Families that had been separated by the head tax, with men having come to Canada for work, while wives and children remained behind, were now permanently separated by law. Men grew old alone in Canada's Chinatowns. They worked in laundries, restaurants, and market gardens. They sent money home when they could. They received letters from children who were growing up without knowing their fathers, except through photographs and occasional written words. Children grew to adulthood, had children of their own, and still their fathers could not come home or bring them to Canada. When the act was finally repealed in 1947, the process of reunification was still difficult. Chinese Canadians did not receive the full rights of Canadian citizenship until 1947. Bringing family members to Canada required navigating immigration bureaucracy that remained hostile. Many men who had waited decades to be reunited with their families died before that reunion could happen. Chinese Canadians referred to the period of the Exclusion Act as the years of the Bachelor Society because the law had deliberately engineered a demographic situation in which Chinese communities in Canada consisted overwhelmingly of men without families. This was not an accident. It was the intended outcome of a policy designed to use Chinese labor while preventing Chinese families from establishing roots in Canada. The loneliness of the men who waited in Canada's Chinatowns during the Exclusion Act years is something that later generations have struggled to fully comprehend. These were men who had built lives in Canada under conditions of profound disadvantage, who had constructed communities and mutual support networks out of necessity, and who spent decades writing letters to families they could not see, sending money to children who knew them only as a name on an envelope. Number 27. The Underground Railroad's Betrayal. Canada is rightly remembered as the terminus of the Underground Railroad, the network of routes and safe houses through which enslaved people escaped from the American South to freedom in the North. Thousands of freedom seekers made their way to Canada, where they could not be legally recaptured under British and Canadian law. This is a real and important chapter in Canadian history, and it is one that Canadians have, with justification, been proud of. But the story that Canadian schools often tell omits the betrayals that followed. Canada was free. Canada was not equal. Black freedom seekers who arrived in Canada found a country that had abolished slavery, but had emphatically not abolished racism. They faced discrimination in housing and employment. They were denied land in many areas. Their children were educated in segregated schools in several provinces. They were barred from many establishments and organizations. And in Ontario, specifically in the 1850s, the black communities of the Dawn Settlement and others that had been established by freedom seekers faced another betrayal. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 in the United States had dramatically escalated the danger for black people even in the nominally free northern states, driving even more freedom seekers into Canada. But Canadian towns and cities were not uniformly welcoming. Riots against black communities occurred in multiple Ontario cities. Violence was common. Some freedom seekers, unable to find adequate land or employment in Canada and facing persistent racism, chose to return to the United States after the Civil War ended. The country they had risked everything to reach had given them legal freedom, but not equal citizenship. The story of black freedom seekers in Canada is ultimately a story of extraordinary perseverance in the face of broken promises. The people who made it to Canada had survived the most brutal institution in North American history, had risked everything to escape it, and arrived in a country that offered legal freedom alongside practical discrimination. Number 28. The War of 1812's Black Corps and the Broken Promise. During the War of 1812, Britain made promises to enslaved people in the United States. If they escaped from American enslavers and made their way to British lines, they would be given freedom and the opportunity to settle in British territories. Thousands took that risk. Several units of black soldiers, the most notable being the Corps of Colonial Marines, served the British with distinction during the war. When the war ended in 1815, Britain did indeed free these people. Many were transported to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. But freedom, as black loyalists before them had discovered, was not the same as equality. The black veterans of the War of 1812 and their families were settled on marginal land, given inadequate tools and provisions, and left to survive in Nova Scotia's harsh climate with minimal support. Many of these communities, particularly in the Preston and Hammonds Plains areas of Nova Scotia, developed into persistently impoverished settlements, The poverty of these communities was not accidental. It was the direct result of the inferior land grants and inadequate support that black veterans received compared to white veterans from the same war. Their descendants are still in those communities today. The socio-economic challenges that face African Nova Scotian communities in the 21st century are directly traceable to the land and economic policies of 1815. The intergenerational transmission of disadvantage created by these early policy decisions is one of the clearest examples of how historical injustice compounds over time. The people living in these communities today are not poor because of personal failures. They are poor, in part, because their great-grandparents were deliberately given worse land and fewer resources than their white neighbors at the founding of their communities. The communities established by black veterans of the War of 1812 in Nova Scotia represent one of the clearest case studies in how historical policy decisions create present-day inequality. Every generation that followed the original settlement inherited both the community that had been built and the disadvantage that had been imposed. Number 29, the NFL, Deconfederation, and the stolen vote. Newfoundland's entry into Canadian Confederation in 1949 is celebrated in Canadian history as the completion of the country, the final piece of the national puzzle. The reality of how that union was achieved is considerably more complicated and considerably more troubling. In 1948, Newfoundlanders voted in 2 referendums on their political future. The first referendum in June 1948 gave 3 options: continue as a commission of government, return to responsible government as an independent country, or join Canada. No option received a majority. Responsible government received the most votes at 44.5%. Commission of government received 14.3%. Confederation with Canada received 41.1%. For the second referendum, the Commission of Government option was removed from the ballot, leaving only responsible government and confederation. This decision was made by the British government over the objections of many Newfoundlanders who felt that the removal of the Commission of Government option was manipulative. The second referendum, held in July 1948, produced a result of 52.3% for Confederation and 47.7% for responsible government. The margin was barely 5%, and there were serious allegations, some of which have been supported by subsequent historical research, that the campaign for Confederation had been heavily influenced by money from Canadian sources flowing through political networks connected to Joey Smallwood, the Confederation advocate who would become Newfoundland's first premier. There were also allegations of vote manipulation and irregularities in counting, particularly in certain districts. Whether the vote was definitively stolen is a matter historians continue to debate. What is not debated is that nearly half of Newfoundlanders did not want to join Canada, that the process was managed in ways that favored the outcome Britain and Canada preferred, and that Newfoundland entered Confederation as a poor province with significantly less leverage than other provinces, in ways that affected its economic development for decades. The economic consequences of Confederation for Newfoundland continue to be debated by economists and historians. Number 30, the national policy and the deliberate starvation of the plains. John A. Macdonald's national policy of 1879 is taught in Canadian schools as a visionary economic strategy: build the transcontinental railway, encourage settlement of the West, and protect nascent Canadian industry through tariffs. It was an economic vision, and by certain metrics it succeeded. Canada did industrialize. The West was settled. The railway was built. What is less often discussed is what the national policy required and who paid the price for it. The settlement of the West required the clearing of the plains of their indigenous inhabitants. The buffalo, the foundational resource of plains. Indigenous cultures were systematically exterminated. By 1885, animals that had numbered in the tens of millions were essentially gone from the Canadian prairies. The extermination was not an accident of uncontrolled hunting. It was a deliberate policy choice, encouraged and facilitated by government officials who understood that without the buffalo, plains peoples would be forced onto reserves and dependent on the government for food, and then the government used that dependency as a weapon. In the early 1880s, as the numbered treaties were being implemented and plains people settled on reserves, the government cut food rations dramatically. Indian agents reported widespread starvation on reserves. Children and elderly people were dying. The government knew. Government officials debated whether to increase rations and decided against it, in part because they believed hunger would compel indigenous people to work and would break their resistance to assimilation. Historian James Dashuk's research, published in his book Clearing the Plains, documented this policy with extensive archival evidence. The conclusion was stark. The Canadian government deliberately used food as a weapon against Indigenous peoples in the early 1880s, and people died as a direct result. The documentation of deliberate starvation as a policy tool in 1880s Canada is one of the most disturbing revelations in recent Canadian historical scholarship. What makes it particularly significant is not just that people were starved, but the paper trail demonstrating the decision-making process. Number 31, the Alberta Eugenics Board's victims. The specific human stories behind Alberta's eugenics program are, in many cases, almost unbearable to read. The Eugenics Board operated from 1928 to 1972. In that time, it reviewed thousands of cases and approved the sterilization of over 2,800 people. The board's definition of those who should be sterilized was fluid, ideologically loaded, and driven by class and race biases that were never acknowledged. People were sterilized because they were mentally ill. People were sterilized because they were developmentally disabled. People were sterilized because they were poor. People were sterilized because they were immigrants who spoke limited English and appeared confused during assessments conducted in a language they did not fully understand. People were sterilized because they were Indigenous and their cultural practices were unfamiliar to board members. People were sterilized because their sexual behavior was considered deviant, a category that included homosexuality and promiscuity, both defined by the board's standards. Leilani Muir was sterilized without her knowledge or consent as a teenager at the Provincial Training School for Mental Defectives in Red Deer. She was not mentally deficient. She had been placed in the institution by her abusive mother and had received an IQ test score that was artificially low due to poor nutrition and lack of education rather than any cognitive deficit. When she discovered as an adult that she had been sterilized, she sued the Alberta government. In 1996, she won. The judge found that the province had committed a monstrous breach of trust against her. Muir's case opened the floodgates. Hundreds of other survivors came forward. The Alberta government faced an enormous class action lawsuit. It eventually settled with over 800 claimants, paying approximately $82 million in total. But many survivors had already died, and the government did not pursue any accountability for the individuals who had served on the board or carried out the sterilizations. The eugenics movement was not fringe science in Canada in the 1920s and 1930s. It was mainstream. It was taught in universities. Number 32, the Dean Nation and the pipeline betrayal. In 1974, the Canadian government began planning the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline, a proposal to run a natural gas pipeline through the Mackenzie Valley in the Northwest Territories, through the heart of the homeland of the Dene Nation, the Métis of the Northwest Territories, and the Inuit of the Western Arctic. Justice Thomas Berger was appointed to lead an inquiry into the social, environmental, and economic impacts of the pipeline. What followed was one of the most remarkable public processes in Canadian history. Berger traveled to Indigenous communities throughout the Mackenzie Valley, conducting hearings in Indigenous languages, listening to elders, hunters, and trappers describe their relationships with the land and their concerns about what a pipeline would mean for their way of life. The testimony was extraordinary. People described the Mackenzie Valley as their homeland in ways that made clear that their relationship with the land was not economic, but spiritual, cultural, and existential. They described what the disruption of the land would mean for their communities. They described the irreversibility of what was being proposed. Berger's 1977 report recommended a 10-year moratorium on pipeline construction in the Mackenzie Valley. He argued that the social and cultural impacts on Indigenous communities had not been adequately addressed, and that the land claims of the Dene Nation needed to be settled before any development could proceed responsibly. The Canadian government accepted the moratorium, but the land claims were never settled. The pipeline was eventually built decades later under a modified proposal. The fundamental issues that Berger had raised, Indigenous title to the land and the right of Indigenous peoples to determine the future of their own territories, remained unresolved. The Berger inquiry is remembered as a model of Indigenous consultation. The gap between the model and what actually happened is the secret that rarely gets told. The gap between the Berger inquiry's process and its ultimate outcomes illustrates a pattern that repeats throughout the history of Indigenous Crown relations in Canada. Consultation without consent is not genuine consultation. Number 33. The Queen's Hotel Fire and the Forgotten Chinese Victims. In 1972, a fire broke out in the Queen's Hotel in Victoria, British Columbia, an aging building that had become home to many elderly Chinese Canadian men, the remnant of the bachelor society created by the head tax and the Exclusion Act. These were men who had come to Canada as laborers decades earlier, who had been unable to bring their families, and who had grown old in poverty in a country that had used their labor and then discarded them. The fire killed 16 people. Most of the dead were elderly Chinese men. The building had been known to be a fire hazard. The fire escapes were inadequate. The building did not meet safety codes. The men who lived there had been living in substandard conditions because they had nowhere else to go and no one who was going to improve their circumstances. The story of the Queen's Hotel fire is not widely known. It does not appear in most histories of Victoria or British Columbia. The men who died in it were, in many ways, the human cost of the head tax and the Exclusion Act made visible. They had lived their entire adult lives in Canada, had contributed their labor to the building of the country, and had died in a burning hotel because the accumulated injustices of Canadian history had left them without resources, without families nearby, without the kind of social support networks that might have ensured they had better housing. Their deaths are a footnote in the history of a community that was itself treated as a footnote for most of Canadian history. The Victoria City government's failure to enforce fire safety standards in buildings housing elderly Chinese Canadian men was not an oversight. It reflected a consistent pattern across Canadian cities of the period in which buildings in Chinatowns and in neighborhoods housing racialized minorities received less attention from building inspectors and city services than comparable buildings in white neighborhoods. The men who died in the Queen's Hotel fire died in a building that should have been condemned. The city knew the building's condition. The men living in it had nowhere else that was willing to take them. The fire was the endpoint of a long chain of institutional indifference. Number 34. the Salmon Arm Riot, and the Ku Klux Klan in Canada. Most Canadians are unaware that the Ku Klux Klan had a significant presence in Canada in the 1920s and 1930s. The Klan was active in British Columbia, Ontario, and most significantly in Saskatchewan, where it became deeply intertwined with Conservative Party politics in the late 1920s. In Saskatchewan, the Klan's membership at its peak in 1927 and 1928 has been estimated at between 20 and 40,000. The Klan organized rallies, conducted cross burnings, and ran political campaigns targeting Catholics, Eastern European immigrants, and non-white people. The 1929 provincial election in Saskatchewan was significantly influenced by Klan organizing, with the Klan's preferred candidates elected in several ridings. In British Columbia, the Salmon Arm incident of 1925 is one of the more remarkable episodes. Japanese Canadian veterans who had served in the First World War and who had been granted the right to vote in provincial elections, a right that had been denied to Japanese Canadians in federal elections, were met by a mob when they attempted to exercise that right in Salmon Arm. The mob, which included local civic leaders, physically drove the Japanese Canadian veterans from the polling station. These veterans had fought for Canada in the same war as the men who were now denying them the vote. The incident occurred in broad daylight, witnessed by local authorities who did not intervene. The perpetrators faced no legal consequences. The incident illustrates the profound gap between the rights that were nominally extended to non-white Canadians and the practical reality of how those rights were denied. The connection between the Klan's Saskatchewan campaign and mainstream conservative politics in the late 1920s is a part of Canadian political history that has been largely avoided in official party histories. The 1929 election, in which Klan-supported conservatives defeated the Liberal government, brought to power a party that had explicitly worked with an organization whose platform included racial and religious hatred. The individuals who sat in the Saskatchewan legislature after that election included men who had spoken at Klan rallies and accepted Klan organizational support. Number 35. The Meech Lake Accord and Elijah Harper's Feather. In June 1990, the Meech Lake Accord, a package of constitutional amendments designed to bring Quebec into the Constitution with Quebec's signature, came to its end not in Parliament, but in the Manitoba Legislative Assembly, and it was ended by one man holding an eagle feather. Elijah Harper, a Cree member of the Manitoba legislature, voted against the procedural motions required to ratify the accord before the deadline. He did this not because he opposed Quebec's aspirations for recognition, but because Indigenous peoples had once again been excluded from a constitutional negotiation that affected them. The accord recognized Quebec as a distinct society within Canada. It made no corresponding recognition of Indigenous peoples who had been on the land for thousands of years before either French or English. Canada existed. Harper held his eagle feather, the symbol of his Cree heritage, and voted no. He voted no with the full support of the Assembly of First Nations and most Indigenous leaders across Canada. His no votes delayed ratification in Manitoba past the deadline, and the accord died. Harper was denounced by some Canadians as having sabotaged a necessary constitutional compromise. He was celebrated by others, particularly Indigenous peoples, as having finally drawn a line. The principle he established, that constitutional negotiations affecting Indigenous peoples required Indigenous participation, was obvious, but it had not been respected in 1981 at the Kitchen Accord, and it had not been respected at Meech Lake until Elijah Harper and his eagle feather made it impossible to ignore. Harper's act of defiance is one of the most important moments in Canadian constitutional history. It is also one of the most underappreciated because the dominant Canadian narrative about Meech Lake treats it as a crisis between English Canada and French Canada, with Harper's role reduced to a subplot. Elijah Harper's no vote cost him politically in the short term. He faced criticism from those who believed he had sabotaged a necessary compromise. Number 36. The residential school survivors who were called liars. When residential school survivors began speaking publicly in the 1980s and 1990s about the abuse they had experienced, the initial response from Canada, from the churches, from media, and from significant portions of the public was disbelief and denial. Survivors described beatings, sexual abuse, deaths of classmates, the deliberate destruction of their cultures, and the response was often to question their credibility. Lawyers hired by the Catholic Church and other church organizations that had run residential schools subjected survivors who came forward to aggressive cross-examinations designed to discredit them. Survivors who had spent their entire adult lives trying to process the trauma of what had been done to them as children faced courtrooms in which their abusers' institutions paid lawyers to call them liars. The government's own response was slow. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which reported in 1996, documented residential school abuses in detail. Nothing comprehensive happened for years afterward. An independent assessment process for residential school claims was eventually established, and it was widely criticized for its delays, its inadequate compensation rates, and the additional trauma it caused survivors who had to repeatedly recount their experiences to adjudicators. The national apology delivered by Prime Minister Stephen Harper in 2008 was genuine and emotionally significant. Many survivors wept. Many said it was the first time they had heard the Canadian government acknowledge what had been done to them. And yet, the apology came after decades during which survivors had been forced to fight, often in courts, for acknowledgement that their experiences had even happened. The years of denial are part of the story. The apology cannot erase them. The legal strategy of aggressively cross-examining survivors to discredit them was not unique to Canada. It was a pattern used by institutions facing abuse claims in multiple countries. Number 37. The St. Louis and Canada's Closed Door. In 1939, the German ocean liner MS St. Louis sailed from Hamburg to Havana, carrying 937 passengers, almost all of them Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany. Cuba refused to let them land. The ship then sailed along the coast of the United States, where the Roosevelt administration also refused entry. The ship turned north toward Canada. Canadian Jewish organizations pleaded with Prime Minister Mackenzie King to allow the refugees to land. Frederick Blair, the director of the immigration branch of the Canadian Department of Mines and Resources, was the most important bureaucratic obstacle. Blair was openly anti-Semitic. He had spent years implementing immigration policies designed to keep Jewish refugees out of Canada. His view was that Canada should not become a haven for Jewish people, and that the desperate circumstances of European Jews were not a Canadian problem. King's government denied entry to the St. Louis. The ship turned back to Europe. After months of negotiations, the passengers were distributed among Belgium, France, the Netherlands, and Britain. When Germany overran Western Europe in 1940, many of those countries were no longer safe. Of the 937 passengers who had sailed on the St. Louis, approximately 274 were murdered in the Holocaust. Canada could have saved them. The Canadian government chose not to. When asked later about Jewish immigration, Blair expressed his view that none was too many, a phrase that became the title of Irving Abella and Harold Troper's landmark historical study of Canadian policy toward Jewish refugees during this period. A formal apology for Canada's refusal to admit Jewish refugees during the Holocaust was delivered by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in 2018. Frederick Blair's anti-Semitism was not hidden. He expressed it openly in internal government correspondence. He described Jewish people as a group that had difficulty assimilating. He argued that Canada had enough Jews. Number 38. The terror of the Indian Act. The Indian Act of 1876 is still in force in Canada today, in modified form. It is one of the most comprehensive pieces of legislation for controlling another human group ever enacted in the democratic world, and it has been in place continuously for almost 150 years. The original Indian Act gave the federal government, and through it the Indian agents, total control over virtually every aspect of indigenous life on reserves. The agent controlled land. The agent controlled money. The agent controlled who could vote in banned elections. The agent controlled whether ceremonies could be held. The agent controlled whether individuals could leave the reserve. The agent controlled the distribution of food and supplies. The agent was, effectively, a small dictator with total power over a captive population. The Indian Act defined who was and was not an Indian for legal purposes. It defined this in ways that had nothing to do with indigenous communities' own understanding of their membership. It imposed European political structures on communities with their own governance traditions. It made indigenous people wards of the state, legal children unable to enter into contracts, own property in the same way as other Canadians, or make decisions about their own communities without government approval. The Indian Act criminalized Indigenous ceremonies. It made it illegal for Indigenous people to hire lawyers to pursue land claims, a provision that was in place from 1927 to 1951, covering the entire period during which many of the most important legal strategies for recovering Indigenous land and rights might have been pursued. The Act did not prevent Indigenous people from serving in the military and dying for Canada. It merely prevented them from having the rights of full citizens. Every attempt to replace the Indian Act has foundered. It is a document that most people with knowledge of it agree is deeply colonial, structurally harmful, and in need of replacement. It remains because replacing it requires the agreement of the federal government and Indigenous peoples on what should come next, and those negotiations are among the most complex and sensitive in Canadian politics. Number 39. The Dion quintuplets and the exploitation of children. In May 1934, Oleva and Elzire Dion, a poor French-Canadian farming couple in northern Ontario, gave birth to 5 identical girls. The Dion quintuplets, the first quintuplets known to have survived infancy, became an immediate international sensation. They were also immediately taken from their parents by the Ontario government. Within months of their birth, the Ontario government passed special legislation giving the Crown guardianship of the quintuplets. The stated reason was protecting them from exploitation. The actual outcome was that the government itself became the primary exploiter. The girls were placed in a specially built compound called Quintland, where they lived like exhibits in a zoo. A screened observation gallery allowed tourists to watch them play in their yard. Over 3 million tourists visited Quintland over a 9-year period, making it the most visited tourist attraction in North America during the 1930s, more visited than Niagara Falls. The Dion quintuplets were used to advertise products ranging from corn syrup to cars. Their images appeared in films, in newspapers, on merchandise. They were photographed constantly. Every aspect of their lives was controlled by a board of guardians appointed by the government, not by their parents, who were effectively treated as unfit on the basis of their poverty. When the quintuplets were finally returned to their parents at age 9, they were strangers in their own family. Their parents were cold toward them, resentful of years of separation and of the attention the girls had received. The family home was deeply unhappy. 3 of the surviving quintuplets, Annette, Cecile, and Yvonne, published a memoir in 1995 in which they described their childhood as abuse. They were not wrong. The Ontario government apologized and provided compensation in 1998. Their childhood had been stolen by the very government that had claimed to be protecting them. The Dion quintuplets story also exposes a class dimension that is often underemphasized. Oliva and Elzira Dion were poor, French-Canadian, Catholic, and rural. Number 40, The Conscription, Crisis and the Broken Promise. In 1917, Prime Minister Robert Borden faced a crisis. The Canadian Expeditionary Force in Europe needed reinforcements. Voluntary enlistment had slowed dramatically, particularly in Quebec, where the war against Germany was widely viewed not as Canada's fight, but as Britain's, and where French Canadians had little emotional investment in sacrificing their sons for an empire that had conquered them a century and a half earlier. Borden had explicitly promised that there would be no conscription. He had made this promise to maintain national unity. He broke it. The Military Service Act of 1917 imposed mandatory military service. Quebec erupted in fury. There were riots in Montreal. There were riots in Quebec City during Easter of 1918, in which the military opened fire on protesters, killing 4 civilians and wounding many others. The conscription crisis of 1917 created a fracture in Canadian national unity that had profound long-term effects. Quebec voted overwhelmingly for the Liberals in the 1917 election. The Conservatives, who had imposed conscription, were shut out of Quebec for generations. The animosity between English and French Canada that had always existed was deepened and hardened. Conscription was imposed again in the Second World War, and again it produced an explosive political crisis, a national referendum in 1942, in which English Canadians voted overwhelmingly to release the government from its promise not to impose conscription, and French Canadians voted overwhelmingly against. Quebec was again outvoted. Conscription was again imposed against the explicit and repeated objections of the province, with consequences for national unity that lasted decades. The legacy of conscription in shaping Quebec's relationship with the Canadian federal government and with the English-Canadian majority cannot be overstated. The twice-broken promise of no conscription in 1917 and again in 1944 created a template for how Quebec understood federal power, as something that would override Quebec's expressed wishes when it became convenient to do so. Number 41. The Banting insulin discovery and the suppressed collaboration. The discovery of insulin by Frederick Banting and Charles Best at the University of Toronto in 1921 and 1922 is one of the greatest achievements in Canadian and world medical history. It has saved hundreds of millions of lives. Banting and Best, along with John MacLeod and James Collip, are celebrated as heroes of science and Canadian identity. The secret, or rather the suppressed truth, is about how the credit was distributed and what happened to the working relationships involved. Banting, a relatively inexperienced surgeon who had the core insight, and Best, his graduate student assistant, did the initial work. But it was MacLeod who provided the laboratory, the expertise, and much of the intellectual framework. And it was Collip, a biochemist, who purified the extract enough to make it safe for human use. Without Collip's contribution, the first human patient might have died from an impure injection. The Nobel Prize in 1923 was awarded to Banting and MacLeod, not Best and not Collip. Banting was furious that MacLeod had been included. He publicly stated that the prize should have gone to him and Best. He shared his prize money with Best. MacLeod shared his with Collip. The 4 men never collaborated harmoniously again. The story of the insulin discovery is often told as a triumph of individual genius, specifically Banting's genius. The collaborative nature of the discovery and the bitterness of the credit dispute are less well known. Banting's fury at MacLeod has shaped how the discovery has been narrated in Canadian history in ways that obscure the actual complexity of the science and the human drama involved. The commercial history of insulin after its discovery adds another layer to the story. Banting and Best sold the patent for insulin to the University of Toronto for $1 each, believing that a life-saving medicine should not be privately owned. Their intention was that insulin should be available to everyone who needed it. That intention has been honored imperfectly at best. The price of insulin in the United States today is among the highest in the world, with diabetic patients rationing their doses because they cannot afford adequate supplies. Number 42. The October Crisis and the War Measures Act. In October 1970, members of the Front de Libération du Québec kidnapped British Trade Commissioner James Cross and Quebec Labour Minister Pierre Laporte. The FLQ was a militant separatist organization that had been conducting a campaign of bombings and bank robberies for years. The kidnappings were the most dramatic escalation of that campaign. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau invoked the War Measures Act, a wartime emergency legislation that had never been used in peacetime. The act suspended civil liberties across Canada. Police were given sweeping powers to arrest and detain without charge. In the days that followed, approximately 500 people were arrested in Quebec, many of them journalists, artists, intellectuals, union leaders, and civil rights activists who had no connection to the FLQ, but who were broadly sympathetic to Quebec independence or to the political left. Pierre Laporte was murdered by his kidnappers shortly after the War Measures Act was invoked. James Cross was eventually freed in exchange for safe passage for his kidnappers to Cuba. The invocation of the War Measures Act is deeply controversial in Canadian history. Trudeau's supporters argue that the crisis was genuine, that the Quebec government had requested federal assistance, and that decisive action was necessary. Critics argue that the scale of the response, 500 arrests, suspension of civil liberties, military deployment in city streets, was wildly disproportionate to the actual threat, and that it was used to target political dissidents rather than actual terrorists. Many of those arrested were held for weeks without charge and eventually released without ever being tried. The War Measures Act invocation remains one of the most contested acts of the Trudeau government, and it sits in uncomfortable tension with Trudeau's reputation as a champion of civil liberties and the architect of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The suspension of civil liberties during the October crisis left a specific legacy in Quebec that complicated the already difficult relationship between the federal government and the province. Number 43. The Wally Surrey Strip and the Missing Women. The downtown east side of Vancouver is one of the most visible concentrations of urban poverty in North America. For decades, women, predominantly Indigenous women, and women struggling with addiction and poverty, worked the streets of the downtown east side in conditions of extreme vulnerability. And for decades, women from that neighborhood were disappearing. The police knew. Missing persons reports were filed. The families of missing women begged for investigations. Indigenous women's organizations raised the alarm. And for years, the police did not treat the disappearances with the seriousness they deserved. There was a widely documented and widely criticized tendency among police to treat missing women from the downtown east side as having simply moved away or having met their fates as a predictable consequence of their lifestyles. Robert Picton, a pig farmer in Port Coquitlam, was arrested in 2002. He was eventually convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder and stood accused in connection with the deaths of 49 women. Many of the women he is believed to have killed disappeared from the downtown east side over a period of years during which police had been told repeatedly that someone was targeting women in that community. The Picton investigation and its failures became a formal subject of inquiry. The Missing Women Commission of Inquiry, led by Justice Wally Opal, examined how police had handled the investigation. The report found significant failures in the investigation, including the failure to take seriously reports from the community about missing women and the failure to adequately coordinate the investigation. The families of the women who died continue to seek accountability. The question of why so many women had to die before the investigation was taken seriously has an answer, and that answer involves the intersection of gender, race, class, and the value that Canadian institutions have historically placed on the lives of women from marginalized communities. The downtown east side of Vancouver has been the subject of more government studies, more police reports, more social service analyses, and more political promises than almost any other neighborhood in Canada. Number 44. The Ipperwash Crisis and the Death of Dudley George. In September 1995, unarmed Stony Point, Ojibwe, protesters occupied Ipperwash Provincial Park in Ontario, which had been built on land that had been taken from the Stony Point First Nation during the Second World War for military use and never returned. The protesters were asserting their claim to their land. They were occupying a park, not a military installation. They were unarmed. Ontario Provincial Police moved against the protesters in the early morning hours of September 6, 1995. In the confrontation that followed, Dudley George, an unarmed Ojibwe man, was shot and killed by OPP Sergeant Kenneth Dean. 2 other protesters were also shot and wounded. What emerged in subsequent years was deeply troubling. Evidence suggested that Premier Mike Harris had been briefed on the situation and that there had been pressure from the government on the OPP to remove the protesters quickly. At a meeting the night before the shooting, Harris was reported to have said, in words that became infamous, "I want the fucking Indians out of the park." Harris denied making this specific statement. The OPP's management of the situation was widely criticized. The Ipperwash Inquiry, established in 2003 after years of the George family demanding answers, found that the provincial government had inappropriately attempted to influence the OPP's operational decisions. Kenneth Dean was convicted of criminal negligence causing death in 1997 and sentenced to community service, a sentence widely condemned as inadequate. Dudley George's family waited years for answers. The land at Ipperwash was finally returned to the Stony Point Ojibwe in 2009, 14 years after George was killed for asserting his community's right to it. The land at the heart of the Ipperwash crisis had been taken from the Stony Point Ojibwe in 1942 under the War Measures Act. The government had promised at the time that the land would be returned after the war. It was not. For 50 years, the community had been trying to get their land back through legal and political channels. The occupation of Ipperwash Provincial Park in 1995 was not a sudden escalation. It was a last resort by a community that had exhausted every other option. Number 45. The Kielburger Wheat, Charity Scandal, and the Ethics of Extraction. This is a more recent secret, one that reveals how Canadian virtue can be packaged and sold. Craig and Mark Kielburger founded Free the Children in 1995, a charity that grew into the WE organization, one of the most prominent youth and social enterprise organizations in Canada. They were celebrated by politicians, by schools, and by corporations. They were the embodiment of Canadian goodness, young people doing good in the world. In 2020, the Canadian government awarded WE Charity a $912 million contract to administer the Canada Student Service Grant, a program to pay students for volunteer work during the COVID-19 pandemic. The scandal that followed was extensive. It emerged that the government had not gone through a proper competitive bidding process. It emerged that family members of Prime Minister Trudeau and Finance Minister Bill Morneau had received payments from WE. Investigations also revealed that the WE organization's internal financial practices, the relationship between the charitable and for-profit arms of the organization, the terms on which speaking fees had been paid to prominent Canadian politicians and their family members, and the degree to which the organization's claims about its charitable impact were accurate, all came under serious scrutiny. We collapsed under the weight of the scandal. The charity wound down its Canadian operations. The Kielburgers faced ongoing criticism and legal challenges. What the scandal revealed was not simply government corruption, but the degree to which a carefully constructed image of Canadian virtue and social enterprise could generate enormous financial flows, while the substance of the image failed to withstand scrutiny. The WE scandal matters beyond its immediate political consequences because of what it revealed about the ecosystem of virtue and profit that surrounds social enterprise in Canada. Large organizations that market themselves as forces for good require scrutiny proportional to the scale of the good they claim to be doing. Number 46. The Catholic Church's Undelivered Apology. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action include Call to Action number 58, which specifically calls upon Pope Francis to apologize in Canada for the Catholic Church's role in the spiritual, cultural, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children in Catholic-run residential schools. The Catholic Church ran the majority of Canada's residential schools. The abuses that occurred in Catholic residential schools were well documented, and for years the Vatican refused to issue a formal apology. The Protestant churches that had also run residential schools had apologized. The Canadian government had apologized. The Catholic Church had issued expressions of regret and sympathy, carefully worded to avoid explicit acknowledgement of institutional responsibility. Pope Francis visited Canada in July 2022 in what was described as a penitential pilgrimage. He met with residential school survivors and issued an apology for the actions of some members of the Church. Survivors and their advocates had mixed responses. Some found the apology meaningful and healing. Others noted that the apology carefully avoided acknowledging that the Church's role in the residential school system was not the action of individual members, but the policy of the institution, authorized, funded, and operated by the Church as an organization. The Church has also been extremely slow to release the records of what happened in its residential schools. The documentation of deaths, of abuse, of the operational decisions that shape the school's cultures is held by Church archives that have not been fully disclosed. The families of children who died in residential schools want to know what happened to their relatives. The Church continues to control access to those answers. The question of what a genuine institutional apology requires is illuminated by the Catholic Church's response to the residential school crisis. An individual can apologize for their own actions. Number 47. The Trans Mountain Pipeline and the Consent Question. In 2018, the Canadian government purchased the Trans Mountain Pipeline from Kinder Morgan for $4.5 billion. The purchase was made because Kinder Morgan was about to abandon the pipeline expansion project due to regulatory uncertainty and First Nations opposition. The Canadian government bought it to ensure the expansion would proceed. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion has been subject to some of the most extensive regulatory review and First Nations consultation in Canadian history. And some Indigenous groups support the pipeline. Some have negotiated benefit agreements, and are equity partners in the project. The situation is genuinely complex, but the opposition of other First Nations, particularly those whose unceded territories the pipeline crosses, raises a question that Canada has never fully resolved and does not appear to be close to resolving. The principle of free, prior and informed consent, which Canada endorsed by adopting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, holds that development projects on Indigenous lands require the consent of affected Indigenous peoples. Canada has endorsed this principle. Canada has also passed legislation implementing it. The Canadian government has also continued to push forward the Trans Mountain expansion over the objections of First Nations who have not consented. The question of what consent actually means in the Canadian legal and political context and what happens when it is withheld is a fundamental unresolved tension in the relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples. The cost of the pipeline expansion has grown dramatically, from the original estimate of $7.5 billion to over $30 billion. The project that Canadians now own through the federal government is significantly more expensive than anyone anticipated. The Indigenous title questions it raises have not been resolved. The financial cost overruns of the Trans Mountain expansion have become one of the more uncomfortable facts in Canadian public life. Number 48. The 60s. Scoop's adoption records. The 60s Scoop left behind a specific bureaucratic nightmare that has haunted its survivors for decades: the destruction, sealing, and falsification of adoption records. Children who were removed from Indigenous families and adopted into white Canadian or international families often had their records sealed, altered, or created from scratch with false information about their origins. Children were given new names, new birth certificates, and new identities. In many cases, their Indigenous heritage was simply omitted from their official records, replaced with a racial designation of white or unknown. Children grew up not knowing they were Indigenous. When they tried to search for their biological families as adults, they found records that lied to them about who they were. Some provinces have opened adoption records in recent decades, making it easier for adoptees to access their original birth information. But the records that exist often reflect the distortions created by the bureaucratic processes of the 60s Scoop. Names have been changed, dates have been altered, community affiliations have been erased. The search for birth family is itself frequently traumatic. Adoptees who find their birth family sometimes discover that parents and siblings have died, that their communities have experienced the devastating impacts of intergenerational trauma in the decades since they were taken, and that the cultural inheritance they were denied as children cannot be fully recovered in adulthood. Language, ceremony, and cultural knowledge that should have been transmitted from parent to child were broken by the administrative violence of the 60s Scoop. The legal battles over access to records, compensation for emotional harm, and accountability for the deliberate falsification of identities are ongoing. The experience of searching for birth family is not universal among 60s Scoop survivors. Some have found their families and experienced profound healing. Others have found families and faced rejection because the trauma of having a child taken does not make their return uncomplicated decades later. Others found that their birth parents died before a reunion was possible. Others are still searching. Number 49. The nurse who exposed the truth. In 2021, a nurse named Carolyn Bennett, no relation to the federal cabinet minister of the same name, made headlines for a different reason. But a decade earlier, nurses and health workers across northern Canada had been quietly documenting a crisis that the Canadian government preferred not to acknowledge. The crisis of addictions, of inadequate health care, of food insecurity, of suicide in Indigenous communities across the north. But perhaps the most specific story of a healthcare worker exposing a systemic truth, belongs to the nurses and social workers who first reported the forced sterilizations of indigenous women. These were people working within the healthcare system who saw what was happening, reported it up their chains of command, were ignored or told to stay quiet, and eventually found other channels. The indigenous women who came forward about forced sterilizations did so at enormous personal cost. They faced skepticism, re-traumatization through reporting processes, and in some cases hostility from the institutions responsible. The healthcare workers who supported them faced professional consequences. The Senate inquiry that confirmed forced sterilizations were still occurring in 2018 was the result of years of advocacy, primarily by indigenous women and by the healthcare workers who believed them. The institutions of Canadian healthcare and the Canadian government had to be forced by sustained public pressure and legislative inquiry to acknowledge a practice that people within those institutions had known about for years. The lesson is one that recurs throughout Canadian history. Injustice does not survive because no one knows about it. It survives because the people with the power to stop it choose not to. The women who came forward about forced sterilization did so knowing they would be disbelieved, knowing they would be re-traumatized by the process of reporting, and knowing that the institutions they were reporting against had enormous resources and credibility advantages over individual complainants. They came forward anyway. That is not a small thing. Number 50, the unmarked graves and the reckoning. That hasn't happened in May 2021. The Tk'emlúps Tsek-Wapemsi First Nation announced that ground-penetrating radar had identified what appeared to be the remains of 215 children buried in unmarked graves at the site of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School. The announcement broke through into mainstream Canadian consciousness in a way that decades of survivor testimony had not fully done. In the weeks and months that followed, similar searches at other residential school sites across Canada identified thousands more potential unmarked burial sites. The numbers are still growing. The work of searching, identifying, and where possible, naming the children buried in these graves is ongoing and will take years. The reaction in Canada was profound. Churches were vandalized. Canada Day celebrations were muted. Statues of historical figures connected to the residential school system and to broader colonial policies were pulled down. The government promised action on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action, many of which remained unimplemented years after they had been made. But the reckoning that began in 2021 has, in the years since, been complicated by ongoing debates about the precise nature of the findings, about the accuracy of ground-penetrating radar results, and about the pace of government action. Some of the most vocal critics have attempted to use legitimate scientific questions about the radar data to cast doubt on the broader historical reality of children dying in residential schools and being buried without proper records, a reality that is thoroughly documented. The children are real. The deaths are real. The system that killed them was real. The question that Canada continues to struggle with is not whether this happened, but what it means that it did, and what genuine accountability, genuine reckoning, genuine change actually looks like. Canada has been apologizing for its history. It is still deciding whether to change it. The children in the unmarked graves were not statistics when they were alive. They had names. From stolen children to stolen land, from forged identities to forgotten graves, Canada's hidden history is a story of survival and of silence finally broken open. These 50 secrets were never secrets to the people who lived through them. They were only secrets to the rest of us, the ones who were never told, the ones whose textbooks left the hardest pages blank. Every single story in this video is documented. Every injustice was real. and the people who survived them, and the descendants who carry that weight today, deserve to have their truth told out loud, not buried. These stories belong to all of us now. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.